Welcome to this ACRAF developed presentation entitled In Australia, Slavery. ACRAF was established in 2005 by a group of congregations of women religious who were responding to a call to eliminate human trafficking and slavery, especially that of women and children. Although begun by women religious, today ACRAF is found throughout Australia and its members comprise women religious, men religious, priests and lay people. Human trafficking is a global problem. It touches every country in our world. No country is exempt. It is one of the fastest growing crimes in our world. The Global Slavery Index and the International Labour Organization estimate that there are approximately 40 million people currently living in slavery in our world. Of course, it's very difficult to get exact numbers for this crime. We can only come up with estimates because it's very much an underreported crime and an underground crime. Sadly, the greater percentage of victims that have been detected as a result of this crime are women and girls, and currently that's round about 80% of victims. So what is human trafficking? The definition of human trafficking has three elements to it. Firstly, it is a process where people are obtained. They are recruited, they are moved, they're harboured, held in positions that cover tracks as they are moved from one place to another. The means by which they are obtained are fraudulent means, deceptive means, by force, by kidnapping. Most people have dreams for themselves, and vulnerable people are no different. Traffickers play on these dreams, promising them a better life somewhere else. But actually, people are being deceived. And when they arrive at the destination, they find that they're being exploited, either in servitude, by debt bondage, by being held in slavery, sexual exploitation, organ harvesting, and many other forms. Modern slavery takes on many faces. A common misconception is that it only applies to women being exploited through sexual exploitation. However, there are many forms of slavery today, including some that were mentioned in the previous slide, and also additional ones here. Forced child labour, forced labour, the use of child soldiers in conflict areas, and forced marriage, just to name a few. The reality is that slavery exists in a number of industries. That is not to say that the whole industry is corrupt, but there are individuals within those industries that are, and so people find themselves being trafficked into the hospitality industry, maybe the cooks in restaurants that we attend, the agricultural industry, people who are growing the fruit and vegetables that end up in our supermarkets and on our tables, domestic servitude, people being held slaves in homes, the construction industry, the mining industry, in particular children who are being forced to mine the minerals that go into our electronic goods, our smartphones, our computers and so on. And sexual exploitation and pornography are other areas of exploitation. Where do the members of ACRAF receive their inspiration for this work? We are all familiar with the words of Jesus in John's Gospel. I have come that all may have life and have it to the full. While ever there are people in our world who do not have fullness of life, we have a responsibility to work towards that. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted in 1948. Article 4 of that declaration states, "No one shall be held in slavery or servitude. Slavery and servitude shall be prohibited in all their forms." Many people believe that slavery went out with the abolition of the transatlantic slave period. However, slavery is still alive and well in our world today. Pope Francis is a great advocate in this area. In March 2014, he said, "It is not possible to remain indifferent before the knowledge that human beings are being bought and sold like goods." He is reminding us that as consumers, we have a responsibility to be informed about whether or not the goods we are purchasing might be tainted by slavery. On a number of occasions, he has commented, "Human trafficking and slavery are crimes against humanity." Earlier, I mentioned that no country is exempt from being touched by human trafficking and slavery. And yes, human trafficking and slavery does exist here in Australia. Australia does have very good legislation concerning the crimes of human trafficking and slavery. However, to date, the number of convictions is still quite low. There are a number of reasons for this. Many victims are reluctant to trust law enforcement agencies because of the experiences they may have had in their home countries. Others, because of the trauma they've experienced, they are unwilling to speak to law enforcement agencies and relive that trauma as they tell their story and ultimately are cross-examined in court. Others just want to get on with their lives and leave the experiences behind them. So the number of convictions and number of cases that we are aware of is really just the tip of the iceberg. Some people have come forward and wanted to tell their stories so that others may be aware and be prevented from experiencing this crime. Women have been in domestic servitude in Australia, and in February 2018, Four Corners did a program where one woman did tell her story. Her story was one where she was held captive in a home, forced to do domestic work all day, unable to leave the home, and forced to give sexual services to anyone who demanded them of her. An Indian cook who was employed in a restaurant in Sydney, he was enslaved to the point where each night he was locked in the storeroom of the restaurant. He was given scraps to eat and a bucket of water each night. When this case went through the criminal justice process, the cook was awarded $200,000 in back pay, and the restaurateur was given a jail sentence. ACRAT is currently advocating on behalf of 22 men from Vanuatu. They were recruited by a labour hire firm to come and work in Australia under the Seasonal Worker Program, an Australian government aid program for the Pacific. The labour hire firm told the men that they had to send ahead their airfares and money for them to have when they first arrived in Australia. The men saw it as an opportunity to be able to earn money and go home and support their families. So they borrowed money in order to take part in the program. When they arrived in Australia, they were not given their spending money. They were housed in slave-like conditions and forced to work from sun-up till sundown on tomato farms in North Queensland. They were given little food to eat and were not paid their salaries. They went home empty-handed. Their case was taken up by the Fair Work Ombudsman and heard in the Federal Circuit Court in Brisbane by Justice Michael Jarrett, who said it was the most egregious form of worker exploitation he had come across. The men were awarded $77,000 in unpaid salary. The labour hire firm was fined, and so was the director of that labour hire firm. To date, the men have not received any of the money owing to them, and it is now over 3 years since that case was determined. ACRAF believes that as this was part of a government aid program, the Australian government has some moral culpability. And so we are asking the Australian government to make an ex gratia payment to the men. If you would like to take part in this campaign, details can be found in the campaign section of the ACRAF website, and your support would be appreciated. In Australia, human trafficking and slavery are federal crimes and therefore come under the jurisdiction of the Australian Federal Police. In the year from the 1st of July 2018 to the 30th of June 2019, there were 216 referrals to the Australian Federal Police. Of these referrals, 40% were for forced marriage. Forced marriage is a growing crime in Australia. It is not the same as an arranged marriage. In an arranged marriage, both parties have a choice, but in a forced marriage, one or both parties have no choice. Other crimes were 31% sexual servitude, 13% forced labour, and 26% of the referrals were spread over debt bondage, organ trafficking, domestic servitude, child trafficking, and deceptive recruiting. Of course, 216 referrals does not mean 216 convictions. And even where these referrals do end up in a conviction, it will be some years yet before that happens. So these figures are just the tip of the iceberg because they're only the figures that are with the Australian Federal Police. And I've mentioned before, many victims do not speak to law enforcement agencies. How is the global community tackling human trafficking? In 2003, 115 countries, including Australia, signed a United Nations protocol against transnational crime, especially the human trafficking of women and children. The protocol has become known as the Palermo Protocol because it was signed in the Italian city of Palermo. The protocol sets out key legal obligations that countries have relating to trafficking, and essentially there are three responsibilities. Firstly, countries must do their utmost to try and prevent human trafficking, and that is done through awareness raising, through enacting legislation, etc. They must prosecute people who are committing this crime and exploiting others. And thirdly, they must protect people who have been trafficked. And as I've said, Australia did sign that protocol, so therefore our Australian government and we as Australians have these obligations. Our Australian government since 2003 has put a number of things in place We do have a government-funded Support for Trafficked People program, but at the moment, only those people willing to speak with the Australian Federal Police are able to access that program. The Australian government has also established special visas for people who have been trafficked, and those special visas have support services attached to them so that people are helped to get their lives back on track. For a number of years, ACRATH, in collaboration with other non-government organisations, advocated for legislation that would prevent goods tainted with slavery being imported into Australia. And so we welcomed the passing of the Modern Slavery Act 2018 by the Australian Parliament. This Act requires businesses that have an annual income threshold in excess of $100 million to give an annual report on what they are doing to investigate whether or not there is slavery in their supply chain, and if found, what they are doing to try and eliminate it. This is certainly a step in the right direction. ACRATH would like to see further initiatives implemented by the Australian government. ACRATH would like to see a national compensation scheme to support victims of human trafficking and slavery and to enable them to build their lives anew. ACRATH would also like to see the appointment of an anti-slavery commissioner. Such a position would have a big impact on initiatives that are aimed at preventing human trafficking and slavery and protecting victims of human trafficking. You might be beginning to feel quite overwhelmed by the information that has been presented to you during this presentation. Some of the information is quite confronting and can leave a person feeling helpless. So how can we take that sense of helplessness and turn it into positive action that can help in the fight against human trafficking and slavery? One of the ways is to become even more informed. Learn as much as you can about this crime by visiting some websites. The ACRATH website has very good information. It is updated regularly, and from time to time there are campaigns that you are invited to take part in. Other good websites are Anti-Slavery Australia, My Blue Sky, Be Slavery Free, and there is a section on the Australian Federal Police website about human trafficking and slavery as well, just to mention a few. There are many others. As you become more informed, you'll become more confident in being able to share this information with others. If you share it with 3, 4 or 5 other people and they do likewise, we have this great ripple effect that's going out, and more people would be aware of the crime, alert to where it might be happening, and therefore steps can be taken to try and prevent it. Another suggestion is to join with other people in campaigns aimed to end slavery and human trafficking. Each year, ACRATH has a slavery-free Easter chocolate campaign. There is a huge amount of child labour in the cocoa industry. Almost 20 years ago, many chocolate companies signed the Harkin-Engel Protocol, a voluntary protocol where they committed to bringing an end to child labour in the cocoa industry within 5 years. As I said, that was almost 20 years ago, and there is still a long way to go in eliminating child labour from the cocoa industry. So we need to keep on giving the message that as consumers, we only want to purchase chocolate that is free of child labour. One of the ways that we can send that message is by only purchasing chocolates that have been produced using cocoa certified free of child labour. There are 3 logos in particular that can help you in making that decision. The YUT certification, Rainforest Alliance certification, Fair Trade. None of these certifications are 100% guaranteed, but they're better than nothing. And so they do help us to send a message that we do not want to purchase chocolate that is tainted by child slavery. And that's not only for Easter chocolate, that's chocolate at any stage of the year. Another suggestion would be to form a social justice group in the parish to address human trafficking, or a group in your neighbourhood, or in your workplace, or in your school. ACRATH has produced a brochure to assist groups. The brochure has a prayer against human trafficking, and it also has suggestions for each month of the year to support you in activities and prayer throughout the year. These brochures are available from the ACRATH office, and contact details for the office can be found on the ACRATH website. Copies can also be downloaded from the ACRATH website using the link currently displayed on the screen. Each year on the 8th of February, we celebrate the feast of St. Josephine Bakhita. Pope Francis has asked that this be a day of prayer, reflection, and action against human trafficking and slavery. Josephine Bakhita was sold into slavery at a very young age, and she is now known as the patron saint for victims of human trafficking. And so we are encouraged to pray through her intercession for an end to human trafficking and slavery. Both prayer and action are important. So as well as praying, we are asked to reflect on what action we might be able to take and then commit to taking that action. As consumers, we can send very clear messages by the goods that we purchase. And so it's important that we try to inform ourselves about whether or not goods we are purchasing are tainted by slavery. You might say, how? Well, there are some goods that are particularly vulnerable to slavery, such as tea, coffee, cocoa, the fashion industry, the electronics industry, and there are resources available that we can look at. In the fashion industry, Baptist World Aid for a number of years now has been producing an ethical fashion guide. This guide lists all fashion companies in Australia and New Zealand and ranks them on a ranking from A through to F as to whether or not there is slavery in their supply chain, whether or not their workers are being paid a just living wage, whether or not workers are in safe working conditions, the hours that they are being forced to work, whether or not they have holiday entitlements, and so on. And so once we have that information, we can be agents for change. A suggestion that ACRATH has in how this guide can be used is looking up and seeing whether your favourite fashion company does have a good grade or whether they've got a poor grade. If they've got a good grade, encourage them, write to them, affirm them for what they are doing in this area. If they've got a lower grade, write to them and tell them how much you like purchasing their goods, that you have been doing so for a number of years, that you're disappointed that they haven't got a good grade in this guide, and are they doing anything to try and improve it? And certainly that is one of the things that we have noticed over the years as each new edition of this guide has come out. Many companies have improved over that period of time. So it's good to encourage that. Baptist World Aid have also put out an electronics guide, but it's not updated as regularly, but it's still quite helpful because we know that there are many children who are forced into mining situations where their lives are at risk. In mining, there's a lot of mercury used, and that can have very detrimental impacts on the development of children and can even cause death. And many of the minerals that children are being forced to mine find themselves into our smartphones, our computers, our TVs, our data projectors, and much of the electronics equipment that we use. So again, it's important that we try to do something to prevent child labour, but also forced labour and slavery for any person. You can also be a real supporter of groups that are actively working against human trafficking and slavery. ACRAF relies on donations in order to do the work that it does. And so every year we do have a particular time leading up to the 30th of July, the International Day Against Human Trafficking, where we try to raise awareness about the issue, but we also try to encourage people to make donations to ACRAF so that our work can continue. One of the things that we'd love to do is to work ourselves out of business. But I think with the current world situation, that's going to be a while yet. And so we really do rely on financial support and are very, very grateful for it. At one stage, ACRAF was receiving government funding, and each time we put in a report, the feedback that would come back from government was they were surprised at how much we could do with so little. And so we do promise you that any funds that we receive, we take it very seriously, that we use that money wisely. During this presentation, we've been inspired by a number of people. We've heard words from Pope Francis. We've reflected on words from Jesus in John's Gospel. We've reflected on an article from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And we've also heard the stories of some people who have been trafficked. So I hope as we come to the end of this presentation, you are feeling inspired and you are wanting to do something. And so I'll leave you with the words of a 20th century leader, Martin Luther King Jr., who said, "Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter."